You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Listening to this podcast? Smart move. Being financially savvy? Smart move. Another smart move? Having State Farm help you create a competitive price when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the personal price plan. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more.
Who are they after the 75 years of essentially being under Hunnic dominion? How do they function?
The night stretches long. The fires in their braziers gutter and cling to life, throwing shadows against the tent wall. Beyond, by the bonfires, you can still hear the drums and the pipes of the wedding party. They will go until dawn. Beside you, the great conqueror sleeps. He is drunk. This evening he drank the whole wedding. Sitting by his side, you watched him quaff horn after horn of brown foaming ale. You spoke no words, none were expected of you. You were only to sit by his side and serve to display the finery he gave you. You played your part well. And then, when he finally joined you in his tent, he was far too drunk to touch you. You helped him to the bed, where he lies even now, his snores loud and uneven, his mustache blowing out with each breath. The great Attila. Despite the legend, he is just a man, felled by drink like any other. Your hand clenches on the dagger hidden beneath your clothes. You despise him. Lots of people do. All the kings and warlords who bow their necks and wear his jewels. They hate his dominion, his power over them, his iron control, the things he's made them do to prove their love for him. Some have sworn secret oaths never to serve with the Huns again after Attila's death. These rumors are, of course, deadly. The oath-swearers would die by torture if he knew. But none hate him like you do. It began the day your brother tried to run. Attila's men dragged him back, and he begged forgiveness, knowing it was futile. Deserters were never forgiven. Deserters were crucified. Everyone knew that. But Attila was in a forgiving mood that day. Instead of crucifying your brother, he set a sword in his hand. With this you may slay a man in your place and prove your love for me, he said. Your brother, desperate, agreed. At a raised hand, Attila's guards dragged in his own father, your father. You watched your brother do it, watched with an impassive face because to cry out or weep would be death. It must have impressed Attila, because not long after, Attila chose you, lifted you up above all the other women to set you among his wives. The night of the betrothal, your brother sought you out and pressed this dagger into your hand. He did not speak a word, did not have to. You knew what to do. You were always your father's joy. He called you Little Battle for your fierceness, your quickness, your skill with horses and the bow. On your wedding night, you will prove your name and avenge him. In the dim light of the tent, you watch the conqueror lie on his back and snore. He is drooling slightly into his mustache. You could do it now. It would be easy. He is asleep and vulnerable, his throat exposed, and your blade is sharp. It would part his skin like an oar parting water. Of course, all would know what you did in the morning, and you would end the day crucified. You fear that end. You wish you didn't, but you do. You raise your blade to his neck, but just as you press down, Attila's chest heaves. He makes a rough sound, halfway between a snore and a bubbling choke. Blood wells up from his mouth and his nose, and it doesn't stop coming. He lies on his back, his chest working like a bellows, blood clotting in the fringe of his mustache, a terrible gurgling rattle coming from his throat. Your father, for all his courage, always urged his children to choose their battles wisely. Slowly, you draw back your blade. It occurs to you that you don't have to cut your husband's throat to slay him. You just have to watch him drown, and no one will ever know. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy, and this is Ancient History Fangirl.
You said it this time.
Can we all just pause for a minute and just take a deep breath and be excited about that incredible cold open about the death of Attila the Hun? When I was, doing a quality check on this episode, I told Jenny, I was like, that is what I want to see in my cold open. That riveted me to this story. So I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm so glad it worked, Jen. We don't do as many cold opens as we used to because of how pressed for time we are in all directions. But sometimes an episode just really calls for it, and Jen insisted I do one. And this was she didn't tell me what to do it about, but I think this was the appropriate topic, I suppose.
I mean, I heavily hinted that I would like to see this, but it's always the person who's writing the episode's choice.
Indeed. Thank you, Jen. I'm glad you liked it.
And you nailed it.
Nailed it. Damn right.
Sorry, I feel like in this world it's really important to just give each other a little pats on the back when they do good things. Listeners, this is me also just giving you a little, you made it to a Thursday or whatever day you're listening to us on. We love you. We support you.
So, we've been busy in the past few episodes. We've taken you on a tour of who the Goths were, their history and archaeology, and what happened when the Goths started to get their fates entwined with the Romans. We've introduced you to the migration era and talked about the pressures, both without and within, that gave rise to the hostilities and conflicts that would eventually be the death of the Roman Empire, if you feel that it died, which some people don't. Anyway, last episode, we told you the story of how the Visigoths, Alaric's people, came to be.
But the Visigoths weren't the only Gothic group who arose in the chaos of the migration era. Besides the Visigoths, there were also the Ostrogoths. Who were the Ostrogoths? How did they come to be? To answer that question, we have to return to the shores of the Danube in 376 AD. We return to that group of terrified refugees, chased out of their homes, barely managing to flee before the Huns. Now they're huddled by the river, waiting for the emperor's permission to cross. Remember, when that permission came, it was granted only to some of the migrants. The Trevingi were allowed to cross. The Greuthungi had to stay behind. What happened to them? That's the story we're going to tell you today.
We're still on the bank of that river, right? We keep returning to the Danube, and we're here with the Trevingi and the Greuthungi, both of them waiting, as the Huns bear down on them, for the empire's permission to cross into Rome. Who were these people, the Trevingi and the Greuthungi? And I want to talk about that because I want to talk about what it means that they parted that way. So remember, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths were not names that the Goths used to describe themselves. Arguably, neither was Goths. But Trevingi and Greuthungi were ancient tribal names older than Visigoth or Ostrogoth. They were perhaps the oldest names we have that the Goths used to talk about themselves, unless words like the Gothones or the Gutones or whatever were authentic names that they used. We don't know on that. These are the ones we know the Goths used. Alaric probably didn't identify as a Goth or a Visigoth, but he probably did identify as a Trevingi. That was his tribe. If you look at Gothic history, you get a lot of dualities. Ostrogoth and Visigoth, Amal and Balth, Trevingi and Greuthungi. This is, I would say, kind of an illusion perpetuated by Jordanes, primarily for imperial myth building. In reality, there were many more tribes of Goths than the Trevingi and Greuthungi, and more than the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. There were Crimean Goths, Pannonian Goths, Thracian Goths, the Goths of Dori and the Sea of Azov. Peter Heather at one point counted 7 distinct groups of Goths that appear at various points in the ancient sources. These are just 2 of the ones that interacted the most with Rome, so we hear the most about them.
The Trevingi and the Greuthungi were 2 different but close tribes of Goths, cousins, you might say, and they were always historically presented as very close. Some ancient sources claim they originally lived on opposite banks of the river Dniester. Greuthungi is perhaps the oldest of the two tribal names, appearing in a Roman panegyric in 291 AD. So the name Greuthungi may have been related to the Gothic word triu, meaning tree. Under this interpretation, Greuthungi may have meant something like forest people. Herwig Wolfram notes that known kings of the Greuthungi tribe whose names were preserved, such as Viduco, Vidimir, and Vidigoya, had names related to the word for wood. So they were the wood people.
So the Greuthungi don't show up in the history until 369 AD in Ammianus Marcellinus, not long before the refugee crisis of 376. So they're mentioned more than 100 years later. That does not mean that they're not equally old. They were said to originate on the Pontic steppe in what's now Ukraine. The root word grut may be related to the word greut in Old English, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, meaning grit or gravel or earth. Some have argued that a number of peoples living north of the Black Sea had names that referred to grit or gravel, and that the name may indicate a connection to gritty, gravelly steppe regions or pebble-strewn coasts. These two peoples lived in close proximity for time out of mind and possibly even migrated together out of Poland, or maybe these arose in Oyum in, Eastern Europe sometime. We don't know. But on the shores of the Danube in 376 AD, their destinies diverged. The Greuthungi went over the river and into Rome. The Greuthungi, well, actually, some of the Greuthungi did join them, starved with them, fought with them, and became the Visigoths. So it is in fact not true that the Visigoths are just another name for the Greuthungi, but the rest of the Greuthungi stayed behind on the northern side of the Danube. As their kinsfolk crossed the river, they settled in to wait for the Huns to come.
Disney Plus wants to know, are you ready? For Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, now streaming on Disney Plus.
Let's do this.
One of the best Marvel movies of all time is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Hey, you weren't listening to me.
I said Thunderbolts, The New Avengers is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Meet the New Avengers.
That's a cool name.
Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, rated PG-13, now streaming on, you guessed it, Disney Plus.
Is there a baby in your life who's about to start solid foods? This can be such a confusing and stressful time. As a mom of 7, I really struggled with spoon feeding my oldest baby. But once I realized that babies can safely feed themselves real, wholesome foods using the principles of baby-led weaning, feeding the rest of my babies became an actually enjoyable experience instead of something that I used to dread. Hi, I'm Katie Ferraro, college nutrition professor and dietitian specializing in baby-led weaning, and I host the Baby-Led Weaning Made Easy podcast. Each week, we cover evidence-based, safe infant feeding practices for parents and caregivers of babies who are 6 to 12 months of age. So, if you're confused by all the conflicting info you hear about starting solid foods, or you want easy, actionable tips on how to safely prep food for your baby, or introduce allergenic foods, or figure out when to drop a milk feed, we cover all that and more, plus interviews with the world's leading feeding experts in 2 new episodes each week. Search Baby-Led Weaning wherever you listen to podcasts, and happy feeding.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
The leader of this group, who stayed on the northern side of the Danube, was a man named Ermanaric. His legend cast a long shadow down through German history. He appears in Jordanes' list of begets that he uses to prop up the Amal dynasty. Jordanes describes him as leading a vast kingdom called Gothia, subduing many other tribes by the sword, and claims, quote, some of our ancestors justifiably compare him to Alexander the Great. Of course they do. Historians dispute how powerful Ermanaric actually was. He was clearly a very important figure to the Goths, and his death left a psychic scar that lasted centuries. His legend has grown and changed with time, and doubtless there were heroic stories the Goths told about him early on that have now been lost. Jordanes' account of him is already mythic, but the oldest accounts of him survive in Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a contemporary of Ermanaric's.
So Ammianus Marcellinus lived at the same time Ermanaric did, and he was a Roman soldier. To him, this guy was not a mythic figure of Ostrogothic kingship. He was not trying to use his legend to perpetuate Ostrogothic imperialism. He wasn't overly attached to him as a ruler and trying to preserve his reputation. Does that mean it's more true? I have no idea. I mean, and Ammianus Marcellinus definitely viewed the Goths as the enemy in some sense, so I'm not saying that he was particularly sympathetic to this guy, but at least his account doesn't have those very visible lenses there. It's a way to sidestep all that, and I'm going to tell you that version for now.
As we know from history, particularly Roman history, there is a reason why they aggrandize enemies too, right? And it's also to big themselves up. So there is a lens there, but I agree with you. This is not necessarily about myth-making. And if he is bigging up his enemy, it's to show how good he is by comparison. So
right. It's not like the Romans didn't also have their lens. As far as what Ammianus Marcellinus' lens is, like, he gets real salty about immigrants, doesn't seem to love the Goths, doesn't seem to be pro-Gothic in any sense. So I'm not saying that that is the case, but like there are these other lenses that we contend with later that we're not contending with here. So anyway, in Ammianus Marcellinus' account, Ermanaric was the leader of that group of Greuthungi who took one look at the starving camps on the other side of the Danube and decided, you know what? We'll take our chances with the Huns, thanks. Then they made camp by the side of the river and waited for the Huns to get there.
Ammianus Marcellinus describes what happened when the Huns finally caught up to the Greuthungi. Quote, the Huns, then having overrun the territories of the Helani, neighbors of the Greuthungi, killed and plundered many of them and joined the survivors to themselves in a treaty of alliance. Then, in company with these, they made the more boldly a sudden inroad into the extensive and rich cantons of Ermanaric, a most warlike monarch, dreaded by the neighboring nations because of his many and varied deeds of valor. He was struck with consternation at the violence of this sudden storm. For a long time, he did his best to maintain a firm and continued stand. But since rumor gave wide currency to and exaggerated the horror of the impending dangers, he put an end to his fear of these great perils by a voluntary death.
What he's claiming here is that Ermanaric died by suicide rather than face the Huns. Jordanes presents a different version of his death, which we will definitely get to in another episode. But for now, let's focus on this one, the one stripped of all mythology, at least what I'm aware of, and Ostrogothic propaganda. He supposedly dies by suicide in the face of the rumor of how terrible the Huns were. I've seen some sources point to Ermanaric's supposed suicide as an early clue that the Goths practiced sacrificial kingship, where a king is expected to take his own life if they've failed in their kingly duties. Ermanaric may have seen his own suicide as a noble sacrifice to the gods, a last-ditch effort to save his people from the juggernaut bearing down on them. You can view Ermanaric's death one of two ways. Ammianus Marcellinus kind of presents it as an act of cowardice. It's possible that his own people perceived it as an act of courageous sacrifice. The sources conflict, but they point in a direction we can triangulate. He left them alone. And without him, the Greuthungi on the north side of the Danube were overrun. They lived under Hunnic domination for the next 75 years.
And I kind of want to just stop for a minute and just really let that sink in. Whether or not it's sacrificial kingship or whatever happened, he left these people alone. And without him, without his leadership, they were really vulnerable. This reminds me a lot of what we see later in Roman Britain, where, when people are waiting at Hadrian's Wall for the money to come, for food to come. And eventually the Romans just leave, and this country, this entire island is now open to raiders. There's no one there who is sort of protecting and leading them. And kind of what you're seeing here, right?
Yeah, it's an act of abandonment to an extent. And you could certainly argue about like whether people who die by suicide intended that way or not. Like, I'm not making a comment on why people do that in the modern day. I'm just making a comment on what happened here.
Exactly, and how it's been relayed to us through the ages, right? And we don't know enough about that culture to understand what that actually meant to this culture. We have to just go with what the sources are telling us. So it's not completely clear how long Erminarch's Greuthungi resisted before they were overrun by the Huns. Ancient sources make oblique references to, quote, many battles and, quote, a long time. But whatever epic battles they fought, they were not written down. And as always, the timeline's a little fuzzy, right? The Greuthungi's time under Hunnic domination is not well documented. And before we get into more detail about what we do know, we want to say that these are all generalizations. Not all Goths experienced their time under the Huns the same way. There were many different groups of Goths besides the Greuthungi who were overrun by Huns, and their experience would depend on things like their location, how close they were to any actual Huns, and even their individual social class, and probably how close their cultures might have overlapped with Hunnic cultures based on, as you said, their location.
Some evidence suggests that if you were a lower-ranking Goth during this time, like a farmer, a craftsperson, you'd have suffered. The Huns did not, as far as we know, practice a lot of agriculture. Their economy was originally probably a nomadic herder society, but by now it was mainly based on exacting protection money from the Roman Empire. But it could also have involved extracting grain tributes from conquered people. Ancient sources suggest that the Huns took grain from some Gothic communities and that it was brutal. From Priscus Attalus, a Greek who hung out in the entourage of Attila the Hun, quote, "These men, the Huns, have no concern for agriculture, but like wolves attack and steal the Goths' food supplies, with the result that the latter remain in the position of slaves and themselves suffer food shortages."
However, for the warrior and noble class, the picture was different. From Jordanes, who gives us an unbroken line of Gothic kings from this time, we get a sense that the Greuthungi nobility were allowed to preserve their pre-existing lineages and kingships. But Peter Heather calls Hunnic domination of the Goths traumatic and points to a 40-year period where the Goths had no kings at all. So, as we've mentioned, the picture here is fuzzy, timeline's fuzzy, hazy. But we have some clues in archaeology. As we said before, the Huns were extremely occupied with bleeding the Roman Empire dry for all the wealth they could. And a lot of that wealth wound up in the graves of rich Gothic kings. I mean, cha-ching!
The Huns have a very bloody reputation, mainly from Roman sources, for killing everyone they came across. But it may shock you to learn that that was not entirely accurate. For instance, it would seem that they did not do that to the Goths. Some, the farmers and other lower-ranking people, they no doubt brutally exploited. But others, the warriors and leaders, the kings, those were useful allies who brought their own followers. Those they brought into the fold to increase the strength of their own nation. Throughout what's now modern-day Romania and Hungary, grave goods in elite Gothic graves saw an explosion of wealth during this time. Wealth beyond the wildest dreams of even the most well-off Gothic families prior to this, for a very select few elite graves. Heather says, quote, "The fact that many of these were the rich burials of Germans indicates that the Huns did not just hang on to the gold themselves, but distributed quantities of it to the leaders of their Germanic subjects as well. These leaders, consequently, became very rich indeed." The Huns preserved their alliances with Gothic leaders through a kind of gift economy. They were the ring givers. They extracted riches from the Roman Empire, and that gold flowed freely through their open hands. By spreading around the plunder, they held their alliances together. This was how gift economies functioned.
Yeah, and Peter Heather explains that if you were Attila the Hun or any migration-era warlord, your sub-chieftains needed a stake in the success of your empire. They needed to share in its booty. Yeah, they did. There needed to be something in it for them. That way, dissent is minimalized, revolt is tamped down on, and things run relatively smoothly. We also see this when Julius Caesar was talking about, like, his own army, right? Like, they need to be doing things. They can't be restless. There has to always be something, like, the next thing. Otherwise, like, you're going to have problems.
This is Jenny Williamson from Ancient History Fangirl, here to tell you about my upcoming scorching romance novel, Enemy of My Dreams. In the last days of the Roman Empire, a desperate princess and a brutal Gothic warlord forged a dangerous alliance. Julia, only daughter of the Emperor of Rome, lives a life of excess and freedom. But when her father dies and her teenage brother takes the throne, he will stop at nothing to seize control of both the empire and his wayward sister. And now Alaric of the Visigoths, a ferocious warrior who has battled Rome for years, has come to the capital to bargain for his homeland. Realizing how perilous her position is, Julia impulsively turns to Alaric, the empire's sworn enemy, and the one man who can make Rome tremble. Best-selling author Elodie Harper says, quote, "This is a hugely entertaining Roman world romantasy with a hilarious heroine and smoldering hero whose adventures in love and war are set against the backdrop of the last dangerous days of an ancient empire. Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold."
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
Raise the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an Enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. Start converting your B2B audience today. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started today at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
But that doesn't mean Hunnic rule sat lightly on the Goths' shoulders. Jordanes indicated that Attila ruled the Goths and his other chieftains with an iron fist. Quote, "Indeed they, the Goths, could not have refused to fight against their kinsmen, the Visigoths, and they must have even committed parricide at their lord's command. There was no way whereby any Scythian tribe could have been wrested from the power of the Huns, save by the death of Attila."
So Jordanes' accounts of history are extremely muddled. Even events that happened just a few centuries or decades before him get mixed up in the history. I did a whole deep dive into how he mixes things up in some sections of this episode that I have now moved that may wind up in a Patreon. You have to take Jordanes' account as really more mythology than history, but I find this one detail about the parricide to be kind of telling. Parricide means killing your family. Your parents, your children, your close kin. And Jen asked me to define this word in the early version of this.
I did, because I was like, I know a lot of sides, but I don't know parricide.
Like, I had to look it up because I actually didn't know either. And I'm just like, oh, that is actually important. Parricide. It means killing your whole family. And this is a dark hint about the hold Attila held over his Gothic allies. Again, as I said, there are a lot of reasons not to take Jordanes literally, but this rings true. So the battle Jordanes is talking about in that quote that we just read you is the Battle of Chalon, which took place in 451 AD.
Schlong.
The Battle of Chalon.
That's what it sounded like to me, Schlong.
It's French, and I think the other name for it is the Battle of the Catalonian Plain. I say the Battle of Chalon because it's just less of a mouthful, but now I'm going to say the Battle of Schlong, and you're all going to just have to like it. Anyway, so we cover the Battle of Schlong. We cover it in our old episode on Attila the Hun and the Rebel Princess. In that battle, Attila and his Greuthungi allies faced a group of Romans allied with the Visigoths. So for perhaps the first time, Tervingi and Greuthungi faced each other across a battlefield. Attila's Greuthungi definitely had kin on the other side of this battle. Attila the Hun would have needed to have absolute iron-fisted control over his Gothic allies in order to make them fight their own kinsfolk. And there's a reason his control would have had to be so absolute. Heather describes the Hunnic Empire as a kind of death machine, with its own kind of gravity, sucking in other warlike peoples and pointing their violence outward to minimize internal dissent. As long as the warlords were fighting and earning booty, and as long as the right ones were getting wildly rich and able to pass on that wealth to their own followers to maintain their own status, the whole thing managed to hang together. The moment that outward-facing violence stopped, it would turn inward, and Attila would be in serious trouble. Peter Heather says, quote, "The speed at which subject groups opted out of the empire after Attila's death suggests that the payments did not compensate for the burden of exploitation." And he further says, quote, "Attila was the greatest barbarian conqueror in European history, but he was riding a tiger of unparalleled ferocity. Should his grip falter, he would be mauled to death." I just want to pause before we move on and just talk about Attila and his tiger. I just love that image.
It's such an incredible image. One of the things I love about historians and the work they do, whether they're ancient historians or modern ones, is sometimes they give you just these incredibly visceral images, right? Like the tiger at his table.
Well, the tiger wasn't at the table, or was the tiger at the table?
Oh, in my mind, the tiger is sitting at the table. He's waiting and waiting. Like he's well fed and okay until he's not. And then he's literally turning over the table and killing everyone in the mead hall.
It would have been more of like a yurt or some kind of a tent.
It might be a mead hall.
I guess if the Goths were having Attila over.
I mean, look, it's definitely a yurt. It would be a huge, lush place to have your meals.
It's like one of those prefabricated meat halls you can break down and put in a wagon.
Some historians believe that the Goths, at least the highest-ranking Goths who ate at Attila's table and fought his battles, took on many of the trappings of Hunnic culture. By some accounts, the Huns and Goths became so entwined that the Goths were essentially Hunnized, the way the Visigoths became Romanized. Herwig Wolfram says, quote, "A new people appeared who had in common with the Greuthungian Ostrogoths nothing more than the name Goth, based upon an old tradition. The relationship between Goths and Huns during this time may have been like the Romans and Goths inside the Roman Empire, where people adopted Romanitas
Romanitas
to function in a more powerful society that would marginalize them if they were too quote-unquote Gothic.
And on top of that, even as they were enriched beyond their wildest dreams, Gothic leaders still had to kill their family members, their kin, sacrifice all that was closest to prove their loyalty to Attila. We don't have any individual accounts of people being, made to kill their dads, like I wrote in the intro to this episode, but we see it happening at the Battle of Schlong.
Well, what kills me is if you think about it, right? Like, you think about different, civil wars or other wars where you have family versus family, right? A lot of times, they're fighting for something they really, truly believe in. But in this instance, depending on what side of the river you came down on, you might be fighting for an army and a cause you don't believe in because you've been sort of press-ganged into it. You have no other choice. So you're literally killing someone you love for no reason other than this person who is oppressing you is telling you to do it. Your other loved one on the other side is going to kill you for literally the same reason. It's just horrifying.
Well, the Visigoths would have been defending their new territory that they've finally achieved after fighting and sacking Rome. But then they're fighting with the Romans, and the Romans are always press-ganging them into things. Like they have these constriction agreements with the Romans. So the relationships were nuanced, but not dissimilar.
Yeah, and that to me is deeply depressing.
Right. Like the Romans would have had an interest in preserving this Gallic territory that the Visigoths were occupying. They would rather have the Visigoths there than the Huns there. But the Visigoths would have been defending their new homeland that they just got. They probably had the most interest in defending this place at the time. From what I remember in my study of this battle from ages ago.
Yeah, but I'm sure most of them would rather not kill their son or cousin or whatever over it,
Well, they possibly would have felt a lot of betrayal. Like, really, you're coming over here to attack me and take away the homeland that we fought for? Like, you?
This is so fucked up. Moving on.
I know. Moving on. So anyway, I was going to give you this Herwig Wolfram quote about the Ostrogoths and their highly ambivalent relationship to their Hunnic masters. Quote, "The Ostrogoths had developed a highly ambivalent relationship to their Hunnic masters during their long subjection. Attila, as well as his brother Bleda, and many other magnates of the Hunnic Empire had Gothic names, and many Goths carried Hunnic names. I did not know that Attila and Bleda were Gothic names. Mind blown." The Goths had become familiar with the practice of artificially deforming the skull with Hunnic tools, with costume accessories, and also with the old custom as practiced in Greater Scythia of princes hugging and kissing each other in front of the people. They had adopted the Hunnic attitude that emigration and separation from the main tribe were serious crimes. Whoever ran away from the Huns showed his contempt for the Goths and lost his Amal identity, which was even more highly regarded than Attila's nobility. But at the same time, the Gothic peoples ardently longed to regain their freedom. The Goths were bound to the Huns by oath and were loyally devoted to them, but at the same time they had sworn sacred oaths among themselves never again to have any dealings with them once they were free. It's a really mixed message there, right?
It's so mixed message, and it's just one of these things where the more you dig into this, and the reason I wanted Jenny to remove certain things is so we could talk a little bit more about the human impact. The deeper you dig into this, the identity schism, fracture for these people is so great. And it's who are they after the 75 years of essentially being under Hunnic dominion? How do they function,
Exactly. And there's a sense that their tradition as Goths would have been kind of this old legendary tradition that they were not connected to in their more modern existence, at the time.
So the Goths had their own origin story about the Huns, which was probably based on oral history, which some historians suggest displays the intense ambivalence with which they viewed their Hunnic overlords. It may date from that time of Hunnic domination. From Jourdain's, quote, "We learn from old traditions that the Huns' origin was as follows. Philemir, king of the Goths, son of Gadric the Great, who was the fifth in succession to hold the rule of the Getae after their departure from the island of Scanza, found among his people certain witches, whom he called in his native tongue Haliurune. Suspecting these women, he expelled them from the midst of his race and compelled them to wander in solitary exile afar from his army. There, the unclean spirits who beheld them as they wandered through the wilderness bestowed their embraces upon them, and beget this savage race, which dwelt at first in the swamps, a stunted, foul, and puny tribe, scarcely human, and having no language, save one which bore slight resemblance to human speech. Such was the descent of the Huns, who came to the country of the Goths." Whoa, Jourdain's.
Right?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. None of it nice. A lot of xenophobia and everything else. Racism.
Got some misogyny in there. Got some racism. Clearly, Jourdain's does not like the Huns very much. I think that's pretty clear. Jourdain's was an Ostrogoth. According to Wolfram, there are layers to this story that indicate it possibly arose either during or recently after the Ostrogoths' occupation by the Huns. Let's pick them apart. This is my favorite. So there are 3 layers, to be exact. The earliest layer is from the 200s AD, and this is probably to do with Philemir and his travels. I'm not sure, he wasn't that clear about what the first layer is, but I'm guessing. The midmost layer comes from the end of the 300s AD, right around when the Goths were first being subjugated by the Huns. And that's the concept that the Huns are somehow demonic and savage and foul and bad, and their language is scarcely human, all of that stuff. This is feelings from the initial part of the Hunnic domination. Because a lot of that also echoes what the Romans say about the Huns when they don't know that much about them except that they see them galloping around and plundering things.
Yeah, you're also seeing the demonic is definitely your Christian monk showing, We're definitely getting that now.
Jourdain's was a Christian.
There you go. And these were barbarians who did not believe in Jeebus. So they were demonic.
The last layer comes from the 400s AD toward the end of that subjugation, and it's the part where the Goths and the Huns are related. Despite their foulness and all that, they are one people, is what he's saying here. So this paragraph kind of encapsulates all this seething hatred towards the Huns, but also this concept that they're related.
It's a loathing for yourself as well.
Yeah, exactly.
It also forms a very different identity than the Visigoth identity. And again, not all Visigoths are, and not all Greuthungi or Greuthungi are one or the other. But, you're seeing a real different origin here, right? It's interesting.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
Hello everyone, Takuya here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
So let's talk about the Battle of Schlong.
I never get sick of talking about the Battle of Schlong.
In the Battle of Schlong in 451 AD, Attila was aided on the battlefield by his allies, warlike Gothic leaders whom he had enriched beyond all imagination, raised them to ride beside him and lead his wildest hunt. The wildest hunt that ever hunted. Attila's wild hunt. I think there's another one that perked a captain that was wilder.
Well, this one is like a real one from history.
Okay, you're the one saying Perkta's hunt didn't happen. I'm not saying that. Don't come at me, Perkta. Anyway.
Jen is more religious than me. I don't know. I'm kind of an atheist.
So, Attila's wild hunt stood with him on the battlefield against their family, their kin who had left them on the shores of the Danube, because the hold Attila had on them was so great that they could not refuse to kill their kin. Jordanes mentions 3 Gothic princes allied to Attila by name, Valamir, Vidomir, and Theodemir.
If you think those sound like they're straight out of Tolkien, there's a reason for that. Because Tolkien is straight out of Germanic legends like this.
And bear in mind, these Germanic legends are deeply problematic for a host of reasons. So, they were brothers and all members of the Amal family, one of 2 exalted royal families of Goths that goes all the way back to Skansa.
Jordanes describes Attila's hold on his allies in bleak terms. Quote, "Now the rest of the crowd of kings, if we may call them so, and the leaders of various nations hung upon Attila's nod like slaves, and when he gave a sign, even by a glance, without a murmur each stood forth in fear and trembling, or at all events did as he was bid." Does this remind me of Republicans? Listeners, it does.
Listeners, it absolutely does. It's not the same thing, but you can definitely see comparisons when you have, one of these leaders who's leading through both charisma and, a certain amount of fear, and the people who stand beside him who just do whatever he tells them to.
Yeah, and to placate this ruler, it's not like they're not getting things from it, some of Trump's allies have been enriched by him, specifically ones rifling through the government right now. And I haven't seen any Republicans actually kill their family, but they are certainly standing by and encouraging and approving measures that Donald Trump is taking that harm their constituents.
And sometimes their own families.
Yeah, look, you're seeing Trump supporters, have their wives and children and people they know deported and still saying that they don't regret their vote. This is happening. Anyway, back to Jordanes. Jordanes describes Attila's hold on his allies in bleak terms. Quote, "Now the rest of the crowd of kings, if we may call them so, and the leaders of various nations hung upon Attila's nod like slaves. And when he gave a sign, even by a glance, without a murmur, each stood forth in fear and trembling, or at all events did as he was bid. But the 3 brothers were keeping a secret." Jordanes tells us that although Attila valued Valamir and his brothers above all other allies, quote, "Valamir was a good keeper of secrets, bland of speech, and skilled in wiles. Because even as they fought their own kin on Attila's behalf, these 3 brothers were swearing sacred oaths, secret oaths, never to follow another Hunnic king once Attila died."
They were swearing sacred secret oaths.
That's right, they were sacred secret oaths.
So, perhaps the 3 brothers believed Attila would fall in battle that very day. They didn't get that lucky, unfortunately. But Attila only lived another 2 years after this. He died in 453 AD. The most well-known account appeared in the work of a historian named Priscus Attalus, who was, as we mentioned before, a Greek who visited the court of Attila the Hun not long before his death. His work exists only in scraps and fragments, and it's quoted in the work of other writers. Jordanes is one of those other writers. He says, quote, "Shortly before Attila died, as the historian Priscus relates, he took in marriage a very beautiful girl named Ildico, after countless other wives, as was the custom of his race. He had given himself up to excessive joy at his wedding, and as he lay on his back, heavy with wine and sleep, a rush of superfluous blood, which would have flowed from his nose, streamed in deadly course down his throat and killed him, since it was hindered in its usual passages." His drunken sleep apnea killed him.
Right. This passage has been picked apart by scholars since antiquity. On the one hand, it's an ignominious death for a warlord who struck such fear in the heart of the Roman Empire, a king who extracted unholy levels of wealth from said empire, made the most feared military dictatorship in the Mediterranean world pay him protection money, who rode a tiger at the head of the wildest hunt. He died of a nosebleed. It's anticlimactic.
Not just a nosebleed, a drunken sleep apnea nosebleed. It's even worse than you're thinking.
It must have been so messy.
I don't know, because it would have been going down his throat. He would have choked on his own blood, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how this plays out medically, what they're talking about here, but such a frat boy death. However, when Attila's men broke into his tent and found his body, there was someone in that tent with him, his new bride, Ildico. She's depicted sitting beside Attila, eyes downcast, weeping behind her veil. Let's take a closer look at her, shall we? First off, that name, Ildico. It's Germanic. We can put together the etymology to see that her name is a diminutive form of Hildas, which meant battle in ancient Proto-Germanic. Not in Gothic, though. The Gothic word for battle is something like Waijo. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but that's what it looks like to me. So she wasn't Gothic that we know of, but she may have been of a related Germanic tribe, and her name meant something like little battle. Etymologists believe a form of this name is preserved in the name Hildur, which appears in later Germanic women's names, such as Brynhildr, Gunhildr, and Svanhildr. Later Vikings gave names like this to Valkyries.
Hot. All from this woman. I love it.
Sexy. I don't know if it came specifically from her and her name, but there's clearly a tradition here.
Well, now it's canon in my head, so you can't change it.
Right. It's from her. What if the depiction of Ildico as a diminutive, weeping figure is a lie? What if she was an assassin sent by her Germanic kin to put an end to their oppression for good?
Swoon. This is where my heart leaped up, and I was like, give me all of this fan fiction. So, this is one theory. It is quite fan fiction-y, but I am here for it, and I think you will be too. This theory says that Ildico assassinated Attila. We've seen it suggested that she hid a sharp implement in her vag, although I don't think that's in the ancient sources. And again, we're telling you it's fan fiction. Don't write a thesis on it,
Or do, but don't cite us. You didn't get it from us.
Or cite us and be like, they said it was fan fiction. So the evidence on the ground that she was an assassin at all is very thin. Basically, she was found at the scene of the crime, and she had a rather martial-sounding Germanic name. Those are the literal clues. But even if she didn't stab Attila with her vag instrument or her vag, Ildico clearly couldn't be bothered to turn him on his side so he didn't drown in his own blood, which is kind of incriminating and also kind of badass. Okay, he's done now, Well,
I mean, to be fair, right? We're both true crime fans, and in true crime, the first person suspected is usually the nearest kin, especially those found at the scene of the crime. I mean, look, I feel like
it's usually the spouse or the boyfriend or the girlfriend. That's usually who it is.
Or I just learned this listening to an episode about some murder, I forget what, but the person who calls it into 911, also a suspect.
Yeah.
Did she have a motive? Potentially, depending on how much credence you give the theory of how the Goths were oppressed. And by extension, other tribes, including potentially her tribe. But again, that's very circumstantial. But the fact that she doesn't turn him over.
Well, again, this is one of those things where I wonder a couple of things. Number one, she's a bride on her wedding. She's probably quite young. I mean, let's say for like decency's sake, she's 18, right? Okay. Probably wasn't, but let's say that. Probably was like more like 14 or maybe 16. But anyway, it might be that she didn't know enough to turn him to his side. It might be that she was so scared and weeping already that she didn't really understand what was going on. Might be she was afraid to tell anyone because they would immediately suspect she did something to him. So, like, there's a lot that also is in the, like, she's just a scared girl. She doesn't know.
Or she was asleep. These are the things I could hear her saying in court.
She sobbed herself to sleep. Like, we don't know. And then she woke up and there's this dead dude next to her. Like, that's also deeply scary.
I mean, to be fair, in the history, we don't even know how she felt about this wedding. Like, she could have been willingly marrying him. Like, I have put a lot of fan fiction on this. She could have been a scared kid. Or maybe she was willingly there. I suspect probably the former, but I do not know.
Yeah, and I think those are also, like, things to add in there. Like, I love the idea that she's an assassin, or she knew enough to turn him over, but just chose not to. Like, I love that amount of agency. There's just a part of me that suspects that she probably didn't even know what the fuck was going on, if she was even awake at the time. Either could be true. Go with whatever theory you like best.
There's a lot of fan fiction you can create around this. There's a lot of opportunity for storytelling here.
So regardless of whatever happened here, by 453, Attila was dead, and he left a gigantic, howling power vacuum that nobody in his entourage could possibly fill. With Attila's death, his wild hunt quickly collapsed, and those three heroic Greuthungi brothers rose to seize freedom in the wake of that death. Valimir, Vidomir, and Theudemir. They fought off the sons of Attila, who were trying to hold the coalitions together, and wrested back their independence in the shadow of Attila's grave.
Although, to be fair, Attila was actually buried in a riverbed just like Alaric, so I don't know that it had a shadow necessarily. I'm such a nerd, I can't stop. Anyway, Jordanes makes their rise to power look smooth and inevitable. Later scholars believe that it must have been a multi-year struggle against not only other Hunnic leaders, but other Gothic kings, that the Amalai royal line wasn't the only royal line. There were many other Gothic noble families, and Jordanes just has a vested interest in making it look like the Amals were the only ones. We'll discuss that more in the next episode. For now, I will leave you with this. That it was these people who had waited on the shores of the Danube for their own annihilation, only for the Huns to reach a hand down and raise them up to ride at the head of their wild hunt, who adopted Hunnic culture and learned the Hunnic language, who became rich beyond their wildest imaginings but also had to kill their own kin to prove themselves, who had spent 75 years steeped in Stockholm Syndrome with Attila the Hun as their cult leader, until finally one of their cousins, a woman, a warrior, a Valkyrie, this is my fanfiction, but why not, took Attila down and flung open the door to their freedom. That's who the Ostrogoths were.
Amazing.
And now you know who the Visigoths were and who the Ostrogoths were. And we now can proceed forward with our story, which we will do in the next episode.
So that's it for this week. We'll be back with the next installment in this story in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you can find us on Instagram, where we're most active, on Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook, TikTok, and everywhere else except for X because it's a hellscape. We are at Ancient History Fangirl. Go to ancienthistoryfangirl.com and sign up for our newsletter. That is one of the best ways to find out what we're up to. We send it out monthly and we give little sneak peeks of the things that we're working on. You should also sign up for our Patreon. Our Patreon is what literally keeps the lights on. It's what allows us to keep doing this work. Without it, we would have to stop the podcast. We know times are tough, but if you appreciate the work we're doing, please kick in a few bucks.
Where can we find our Patreon, Jen?
Patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl.
Yeah, so we have 2 members to thank this week, Tanya Haybeck and William J. Jackson. Our Patreon numbers have been quite low lately. You may have noticed the past couple of episodes, and we really cannot keep doing this podcast without the help of our patrons. We don't make enough advertising revenue to support us on this podcast. It is a full-time job for 2 people. We still have to do other things to keep the lights on because we are not making enough of this podcast to just do that. And you may have noticed we went bi-monthly. We used to be weekly. That's because we could not keep the pace up at that level. We had to do other things to make money. So please do contribute to our Patreon. We know times are really tough, but if you can, please do that, and it will help us keep going.
Thank you, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Hey everyone, it's Jen and Jenny here. And as an extra special treat, we're giving you an excerpt from the audiobook version of Jenny's novel, Enemy of My Dreams, narrated by the superb Lisa Flanagan.
It's an enemies to lovers romance about Alaric of the Visigoths and a fictional Roman princess, Julia. All of this is very fictional. But anyway, one of the fun enemies to lovers things going on here is Julia has to persuade Alaric to work with her to get what she wants, which is an empire, obviously.
What girl doesn't want an empire?
Right, give her what she really wants for Valentine's Day, you know.
Or her birthday, or Christmas, or whatever holidays you celebrate. Or just a random Tuesday.
In the beginning of the book, their goals are a tad misaligned, shall we say. This scene isn't super spicy, but I would say that there is definitely some sexual tension here. And it's great because it's the scene where she's hungover in the woods and decides to try to vagmatize him, which is a sign of how desperate things are getting here.
We hope you get a huge kick out of Lisa Flanagan's narration here and the scene in general, and you can pick up the audiobook or a physical copy. The hardbacks are gorgeous, or an ebook wherever all good books are sold.
Lie on her back as she was made to do indeed. Julia would admit in the interest of fairness that she had drunk far too much last night. And she'd perhaps overestimated her own ability to hold the foreign liquor, which did not agree with the Blue Lotus. She'd vomited twice this morning. But nothing about the situation had required him to mock her before all of his men. The man wasn't just a terrifying warlord. He was rude, and for no good reason. She could give him everything he wanted, if only he would help her with the pesky little problem of not currently being empress. Why wouldn't he take what she offered? Why wouldn't he take what she offered? Julia sat with her back to a tree, watching the men roll themselves in their cloaks and prepare for sleep. She didn't have a cloak. They all expected her to sleep on the ground and eat shoe leather. Her body still ached in places she didn't know existed from the long days spent on the horse. In Alaric's arms. A slow flush heated her cheeks. That man had no right to be so beautiful. Just looking at him made her angry. What right had he to be so tall and so perfectly built? She couldn't stop staring at the swell of his chest beneath his tunic, the chiseled strength of his arms. But looking at his face was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Clean-shaven and arrogant, skin tinged with gold as if he spent all his time in the sun. And those eyes. The shock of meeting his gaze was enough to make her forget her own name. She could hate him for that alone. He was across the clearing now, rubbing his horse down with a handful of grass. Julia couldn't help but stare at the way his back muscles shifted beneath his tunic, the way he placed a hand on the horse's haunch, speaking low. She sucked in a furious breath. He hadn't touched her last night. She'd woken up in the tent that morning, freezing on the hard ground, and her head pounding worse than it ever had in her life, thoroughly untouched. She'd been at his mercy, and he hadn't touched her. He did want her, did he not? Had she imagined the heat that seemed to scorch her skin whenever he looked at her? If he ransomed her back to Honorius, she was done for. Julia felt her hands clench into fists. He had refused her alliance. All that was left was seduction. She could admit last night hadn't been her most elegant attempt. But since when did a woman have to be elegant to seduce a man like that? He was a barbarian, was he not? Accustomed to taking what he wanted. She would have to try again. Sober this time. Dark had fallen by now. Alaric was still awake, sharpening that wicked curved sword of his while he kept watch. He looked like everyone's nightmare of raiding barbarians in the night come true. She felt a slash of fear. A man like that wouldn't be gentle. He would take what he wanted, use her as he liked. A hot, explicit pulse bloomed between her thighs. Julia shifted uncomfortably on the ground. Stupid body. It would work, she told herself. Did men not fall at her feet? Cornelius had. And he had died for it. Julia felt a stab of sudden crippling guilt. She shoved it away. Think, she told herself. How should it be done? She was a princess of Rome. She would not simply crawl under his cloak like a camp follower. But there was a river between the trees. It would be the perfect place for a seduction. Moonlit and private. Julia rose to her feet. Alaric's gaze fell on her, and for a moment she couldn't move as he lazily perused every inch of her. She felt it, a wave of heat that ignited an answering burn beneath her skin. Oh, yes, he wanted her. He did. This would work. She turned and started walking through the trees. The water broke the moon's reflection into 1,000 shards of silver. Soft mosses cushioned her footfalls. It was a very mythological place. She would have chosen a perfumed bed for her first time, piled high with silks and cushions. But this would do. Her throat was suddenly dry with terror. Julia had always been aware of the effect she had on men. They blushed and stammered and averted their eyes, made fools of themselves to gain her favor. Of course, her body would be pledged as her father willed, and if she turned up pregnant before marriage, that was a dire offense. In addition, her mother's death in childbirth still gave her screaming nightmares. None of that prevented her from taking lovers, of course, but she had always chosen very carefully. Men like Cornelius, sweet and biddable and easily controlled. Men so grateful for her favor that they would never dare transgress beyond what was offered. Which was to say that the princess with the reputation for orgiastic revelry was still, technically, a virgin. Alaric was completely unsuitable to share her bed, of course. If she'd ever met a man like him at court, she'd run in the opposite direction. But now she needed his favor. It was also terribly unfair. Would it hurt the first time? Not with a considerate lover, but Alaric would surely be a brute. Stupid. What did it matter if it hurt? Starving on Pandateria would hurt worse. Julia eyed the sluggish water with trepidation. There were probably snakes and bugs and eels in that water. This was the furthest thing from her seduction of Cornelius. There was dirt under her nails, and her hair was long and loose and tangled, crusted with something she shuddered to name. Her gown was a torn, soiled wreck. She had no armor. Julia sighed. She knew what had to be done, and she did not want to. Did not want to go into the river and rise from it nude, hair streaming wet down her back. She would keep her gown on. It was silk. It would cling. Julia dipped a toe into the water and flinched. It was freezing. Hopefully the barbarian warlord would at least concede to do the deed on the bank. The bottom of the river was thick with mud that squelched between her toes. Julia waded into the river up to her thighs. Then, missing nothing in the world so much as her clean, heated baths at home, she sank into the water up to her breasts and waited. And waited. Really? Julia gritted her teeth. She was shivering violently now. Was it possible he had misinterpreted her blatant invitation? Who did he think he was to make her wait? Something cold and slimy brushed her feet. Julia leaped up with a yelp. When she looked back, he was leaning against a tree on the riverbank, watching her. Is this an elaborate performance for me? I'm honored. Casually she stood, wringing out her hair like she'd seen Aphrodite do in a famous portrait. What performance? I'm simply having a wash. You gave no orders not to. He smiled faintly. You don't strike me as the kind who follows orders. Very perceptive. I prefer to give the orders. Julia let her voice drop to a suggestive purr. I will only obey a man worthy of commanding me. Slowly she began to walk toward him, trying not to slip on the treacherous river bottom. His eyes were on her with the fierce attention of a wolf watching a wounded deer. Suddenly she was extremely aware of how her wet clothes stuck to her body. "Is this what you want, woman?" There was a harsh edge to his voice. He was so direct. Her face heated. "Does it matter what I want?" "Yes, it damn well matters. Julia." He purred her name, a mocking edge to his voice. Then he pulled off his tunic and stood before her, naked from the waist up. Her face went up like a bonfire. Julia had seen plenty of men's naked torsos before, but with the exception of gladiators, those had been very different from Alaric. In her circles, the smooth, slim perfection of youth was the ideal. No hint of vulgar excess. Excessive wasn't how she'd describe Alaric. Magnificent was more fitting. She saw a broad, muscular torso hard from a lifetime wielding sword and spear, crossed with scars that only made him more breathtaking. The only thought she could summon was that everyone she knew had been wrong about male beauty. Completely wrong. Suddenly she wasn't cold at all. She was burning in her own skin, and he hadn't even touched her. Then he looked at her with a mocking turn of his mouth and tossed her his shirt. "Since you're down there, wash this." She caught it on instinct. It smelled of man and horse and sweat. His laughter curled her toes in the riverbed, and she had never hated anyone more. You bastard!" she made as if to rip it in half. "I wouldn't if I were you." He turned and started back to the camp. "And wash yourself while you're at it, Julia. There's vomit in your hair."